I just wanted to start by giving you some context of how this project got started. The Wabamun Watershed Management Council, which is made up of residents and some industry folks from around Wabamun Lake, have been on a path to improve the condition of their lake by first understanding its unique conditions. In the spring of 2014, they approached us to help fill in one of their critical data gaps, which is the condition of the Riparian area. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept of a riparian area, which I hardly believe to be the case in this room, it is the transitional zone between an aquatic ecosystem and the upper portions of the watershed that run into it. It is a really important question to answer because healthy riparian areas fulfill some very important ecological functions. The roots and stems of riparian plants, for example, are living filters. They trap and absorb nutrients, sediments, and pollutants that are carried by runoff from surrounding watersheds. And thus they maintain and improve the health of water quality of a lake. Spongy riparian soils act as buffers, intercepting and storing runoff and floodwaters by recharging groundwater and releasing it slowly back to the lake in dry periods. The roots and riparian plants stabilize shoreline soils, protecting it from erosion caused by the energy that's built up in waves and boat wake action that's hitting the shoreline. And riparian vegetation provides habitat for wildlife, while emergent riparian vegetation provides feeding, spawning, and rearing habitat for fish. These are ecosystem services. To benefit from these services, we need to ensure that natural shoreline vegetation in riparian areas are maintained in a healthy condition. Healthy riparian areas, they benefit us all, but some of the activities that we take, either as a community or as an individual, they can damage the riparian areas and affect the lake's natural ability to filter pollutants, prevent erosion, and support fish and wildlife. So if you look at this map, we didn't just look at the riparian zone, but we also looked at the buffer zone, which is a small strip between the upper land area and the riparian zone, as well as the emergent portion of the littoral zone, which is where plants are actually above the water level. And this has been coined as the riparian management area for the purposes of this kind of project. This is the area that we're looking at, and for the purposes of this discussion, I'm only going to be referring to it as a riparian area, so please don't get it confused with the riparian zone. So there are different methods that can be used to assess the health of riparian areas, providing coarse scale to fine scale results. The use of aerial video footage is considered coarse scale. One of the advantages of using this method is that large regions can be assessed continuously by one single viewer within a short time frame. I want to emphasize that it is important that it is appropriate to use coarse scale methods for generating information about broad trends in riparian health. It is not appropriate to use these sorts of assessments to provide site-specific advice to landowners. There's other programs that do this very well, Cows and Fish and Nature Alberta, and they're both here today if you want to ask them questions about that. So in the past, the most popular approach to capturing aerial videography has been by helicopter, and I want to quickly show you a clip of video taken in this manner. So this is videography taken in the old school way. It could be interchangeable with a helicopter. This is actually taken by a ultralight, but like I said, the imagery is pretty well interchangeable. It's very coarse scale. The airplane is quite high up, a lot higher than we would like. This is as low as they can get without it being a safety concern. And then the other thing that you'll notice is when I hit pause, it's pretty grainy. And when I'm doing an assessment, I really need to be able to hit pause in order to be able to ask the next set of questions that are part of the assessment. Oh, this is actually Wabamun Lake. It was done in 2002, so a flight was done for Wabamun in 2002. It hasn't been assessed yet. That would be a next step for us. And then this is Wabamun in last year, so 2014. Losing track of time here. So as you can see, it's a much clearer image. It's stabilized. It's very, very, very stable, and it's quite low. So we can see the emergent area, we can see the riparian zone, and then we can see a bit of the buffer zone as well. We could go even lower. We could hover the thing around this height, but it wouldn't be useful. We need to be able to see all of that area. So this is about 30 meters up in the air. So if you've seen enough of that. Oh, also I wanted to say, when I hit pause, it's like a photograph. It's very clear, and I can also zoom in and get even more detail. But what I can't see from that height, I can't do any species identification. So that is a problem which is why we can't do site-specific advice. So there's also other limitations to the helicopter method. It's quite expensive to do. This method is a lot cheaper. And the other obstacle is that with helicopters, you sometimes have to compete with for pilot time with the oil sands. So that can sometimes be tricky as well. So when we uploaded the imagery onto a computer, we used a software called Dashware, and we overlaid onto the video footage the spatial data, including altitude, speed, latitude, longitude, and some inset maps. So we can see where the height is, we can see how fast we're going, we can see lat long, and where we are on the map. So I won't go into too many details about the scoring method. Essentially, we divided the lake into segments of homogeneity, which basically means that if there's any sudden changes in the landscape, such as going from a natural area to a developed one, a new segment is created. Wabamun Lake had over 300 segments. You could think of this as fragmentation. I wouldn't read too much into whether this is a good number or a bad number, because a large segment could be a natural area, or it could be just a very uniformly highly impaired area. But what it really indicated is how much work I had to do. So a series of 7 questions was asked of each segment in order to gauge the ability of that ecosystem to perform a number of ecological functions that I mentioned in the beginning. The scorecard is standardized and has been used to examine 25 other lakes in Alberta, and was developed in 1996 by Mills, Wicklum, and Schimger, which I'm saying wrong. I will note that the training, I was provided training on the use of these methods by George Walker, who was responsible for a lot of those other 25 studies, and he's since retired. I would also like to note that we did use GIS software and data to help us with this process. It was crucial. Using orthorectified photos, we were able to physically measure features such as the size of a house or the length of a beach, and we were able to calculate the proportion of a segment covered with those features. So for example, one of the questions asks if more than 35% of the segment is covered with a hardened feature. We were much better able to do this by using our handy dandy GIS tools. So to estimate an average rating for each lake, the sum of the weighted scores was calculated using length as a priority factor. And basically this is somewhat fancy math to account for the fact that each segment was a different length and a different rating. Wabamun Lake received an average score of 7 out of 11 possible points, meaning that it is moderately impaired in its capacity to perform riparian functions. It can be further broken down. 57% of the riparian area 57% of the riparian area is healthy, 9% is moderately impaired, and 34% is highly impaired. In this study, we also measured items such as length of unnatural beach, 4.6 kilometers, amount of hard armoring, 5.9 kilometers, the amount of bare ground, 25.9 square kilometers. We also counted the number of buildings in the riparian area, boats, docks, and the boat launches, whether they be formal or informal. Generally, on Wabamun Lake, the areas of riparian areas that were most highly impaired were associated with residential development. So that was a pretty map that you saw, and this is a pretty chart, but what can you do with this information? For one thing, we made a connection between residential development and riparian impairment. So we could start with an education campaign aimed at addressing this correlation, and in particular, focusing on those highly impaired areas, with maybe the Alice project, for example. Another thing that we could do is cross-compare jurisdictions to perhaps gauge if there's an issue with policy or maybe enforcement, and perhaps use this information to approach those jurisdictions in a friendly way, of course, with this information, and maybe it can be used to change minds regarding policy or practices. This is a chart comparing the jurisdictions that are managing land around Wabamun Lake. It is organized by the amount of riparian area that they manage as in ascending order. And it is also organized based on proportion of how much, the health rating of those areas. So we've got the village of Wabamun, we've got Alberta Crown Land, we've got a consortium of summer villages, which I'll break down in a minute. We've got Paul Band First Nation, which is doing quite well. We've got Parkland County, and we've divided that into their subdivisions and hamlets, and then we've also divided that into their other areas, so that would be areas that haven't been subdivided, and they're kind of subject to different rules. So that is what that graph looks like. Parkland County accounts for about just over 50% of the management on this lake, so I'm not picking on them, but I will be referring to them quite a bit in this presentation. So as I said, summer villages have been broken down here, and we can take it even further. We can break it down into smaller regions, neighborhoods, subdivisions and hamlets of Wabamun Lake, again in ascending order. So I want to note that the reason why we did these charts is not to give residents and governments an opportunity to point fingers at each other. I think everyone is a little tired of that. The reason why we did this is because if you look carefully, you'll see that there's room for improvement in all the jurisdictions. And these comparison charts act as report cards to assess progress over time as each jurisdiction strives to improve their own situation. Before I go on, I want to explain the concept of an environmental reserve. The MGA says that when a municipality subdivides, it can take approximately 10% of the land for municipal purposes. This is a land reserve. If the subdivision is around a water body, the MGA recommends taking the riparian area and designating it as an environmental reserve. With that, it affords it extra special protection under the MGA. But municipalities are not required to use this special designation. And in fact, there's hardly any land around Wabamun Lake that has this designation as an environmental reserve. Instead, what we have are a whole bunch of regular old land reserves where municipalities can do with it what they want within reason, whether build roads, schools, parks, natural, or leave it natural. Keep in mind, though, that these are still public lands, and private citizens cannot alter these lands, such as removing vegetation, without permission from the municipality or the government. Otherwise, it's vandalism. One of the most surprising revelations of this project was the trend of encroachment. Approximately 52% of the riparian area within Parkland's subdivisions in hamlets is contained within a reserve land. So that means when they subdivided, they did take that chunk, that riparian chunk, though as I said, they haven't designated as an environmental reserve. So 50% of the land is in an environmental reserve lands, and as you can see, of those reserve lands, 31% is healthy, 23% is moderately impaired, and a whopping 46% is highly impaired, which is higher than the lake average. It was evident that adjacent landowners were often using these reserve lands as continuation of their own private properties. So this poses a very interesting question, because environmental reserves are one of the tools in our toolbox that we were talking about yesterday. The big question is it a tool that works? I'd like to say yes, because in comparison, the riparian condition within reserve lands is still, proportionately, it's still in better shape than on private properties, where only 9% is healthy, 12% is moderately impaired, and 79% is highly impaired. Sorry, that was my slide about the environmental reserves are not necessarily on Wabamun Lake. So when we look at summer villages, the story is a wee bit different. There's some summer villages that don't have any land reserves at all. Some of them, Batula Beach is completely contained within a reserve land. And when you look at Lakeview and Seba Beach, the reserve lands are actually in worse condition than the private land. But yeah, I think that there are some exceptions here, because Seba's situation is not necessarily one of encroachment. It's probably one rather of a very large public access point. So if we take this information to these jurisdictions and ask them for action, what would we recommend? We put this slide together to summarize how difficult different sorts of actions would be based on the severity of the riparian impairment and the legal authority of the land managers to take action on that land. So basically, it's easy for them to manage their own land that they own, a little bit more legally challenging to retroactively enforce some regulations on private property. So as this chart shows you, 57% of the lake is automatically, if you add extra protections on it, you can preserve 57% of the lake. That's it's an easy one right off the bat. Restoring moderately impacted and highly impacted areas on reserve lands, that accounts for 15% of the lake. So that's jurisdiction that's owned by public property. So if you restore that, you've got another 15% of the lake covered. Restoring moderately impacted areas on private property. So if somebody has, they don't have a house on it, they just have some kind of vegetation growth, or they're mowing or something. So you're asking them to sort of put a stop to that. It doesn't take much effort to restore these lands. That accounts for 6% of the lake. So in total, you've got 78% of the lake restored by action, pretty right off the bat, and it's not that hard. The last one is restoring highly impacted areas on private property. That is a really tough one. There's potential for buildings to be on those areas. If you approach landowners and ask them to move their buildings, they're probably going to take you to court on that. So in terms of restoration costs, it's high, and legal costs, it's also high. So we also did this exercise on Jackfish Lake and Mayatan Lake, and here are the results. This one's Jackfish Lake. And again, we were interested in the idea of encroachment. So we've got, this is private property. This is public property that's owned by the county, because there's only 2 jurisdictions on both Mayatan Lake and Jackfish Lake. It's the Parkland County and the Crown. So this is Parkland County, 61%, still better than the private property. And this is Crown land, 69%, still better than private property. So this is Mayatan Lake, and these are the results. 79%, not as good as 89, and about the same for Crown land. So both of the last 2 projects were sponsored by their respective lake groups, and with that I'd like to acknowledge the Wabamun Watershed Management Council, in particular Stan and Jack, for taking me out on their boats, and Jackfish Lake Management Society, thanks to Myron for taking me out on his boat, and Mayatan Lake Management Society, and to that whole group. I wasn't there that day, but they all kind of waved off Ryan, who was our drone operator, and he was set out on a raft because he couldn't get a boat in there. So yeah, so oh, and last but not least, I'd like to thank the Land Stewardship Center for their Watershed Stewardship Grant, which funded the Wabamun portion of this project and therefore made the whole project possible. And plugging in for them, they have their next deadline for that grant opportunity is the beginning of October.